The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over a rural town in Burkina Faso, its rays beating down like hammers of fire upon the parched earth. Clouds of dust rose from the unpaved road, swirling in the hot wind that carried the mingled scents of sweat, dried earth, and the distant smell of cooking fires. The air shimmered with heat, making the horizon dance and waver like a mirage. This dusty, rutted road that wound its way between small mud-brick huts was a familiar path for schoolgirls returning home and women laborers making their way back from the markets. The road had witnessed countless footsteps over the years, the hurried patter of children's feet, the steady trudge of women balancing heavy loads on their heads, the occasional rumble of a truck carrying goods to distant villages. Today, like most days, a group of young women was returning from the market. They walked in a loose formation, their heads adorned with woven baskets filled with vegetables, grains, and household goods. Their faces showed the weariness of a long day's work, but there was a certain contentment in their eyes, the satisfaction of tasks completed, of provisions secured for their families. Their colorful wraps swayed gently as they walked, and their quiet conversations created a gentle murmur that floated on the dusty air. But that contentment was not destined to last much longer. At a bend in the road, where the path curved around a cluster of acacia trees, a military vehicle stood parked ominously in the shade. Its olive-green paint was dulled by layers of dust, and its presence seemed to cast a shadow far larger than its physical form. 3 armed soldiers lounged near the vehicle, their uniforms stained with sweat and their rifles casually slung over their shoulders. Their faces bore no trace of the dignity and honor that should have accompanied their uniforms. Instead, there was arrogance, boredom, and something darker lurking in their eyes. These soldiers had made it their habit to stop passers-by on this road, particularly women traveling alone or in small groups. They were conducting what they called security checks, but everyone in the village knew better. These checks were nothing more than opportunities for harassment, for exercising the power that came with wearing a uniform and carrying a gun. As the women approached, the soldiers straightened up, exchanging knowing glances and smirks. One of them stepped forward, raising his hand in a gesture that was more command than request. "Stop right there," he called out, his voice carrying an edge of authority that brooked no argument. "We need to check your belongings." The women stopped, their cheerful chatter dying away immediately. They exchanged nervous glances, their hands instinctively tightening on the baskets they carried. They had heard stories about such encounters, stories that made mothers warn their daughters to travel in groups, to avoid certain routes, to stay silent and compliant when confronted by men in uniform. One soldier began rifling through a woman's basket, spilling vegetables onto the dusty ground with careless hands. Another made crude jokes, his laughter harsh and mocking. The third soldier, emboldened by his companions, reached out toward a young woman's headscarf, his intentions clear in his leering expression. The girl recoiled, stepping backward with fear evident in her widened eyes. Her breathing quickened, and her heart hammered against her ribs. She clutched her basket tighter, as if it could somehow shield her from what was happening. "Why so shy?" one of the soldiers taunted, his voice dripping with false sweetness. "We're here to protect you, aren't we?" His tone was mocking, and his companions laughed at his words. Protection, the word was a bitter joke. These men were not protectors. They were predators wearing the uniform of defenders. In the distance, villagers who had been going about their daily business stopped what they were doing. They watched from doorways and windows, their faces troubled but their bodies frozen in place. Everyone knew the unspoken rule. Confronting soldiers meant inviting trouble, possibly even death. The military had long operated with impunity in these rural areas, and the common people had learned through bitter experience that resistance was futile. But among those women standing on that dusty road, there was one whose spirit refused to be cowed. Her name was Asiata, and while her body trembled, it was not entirely from fear. Anger burned in her chest, anger at the injustice, at the abuse of power, at the systematic humiliation that women in her position had to endure day after day. Gathering what courage she could muster, Asiata spoke up, her voice soft but steady. "We are like your sisters. your family members. Please show us respect." Her words hung in the air for a moment, a brave plea for basic human dignity. The response was immediate and crushing. The soldiers burst into raucous laughter, slapping their thighs and pointing at her as if she had told the funniest joke they had ever heard. One of them mimicked her voice in a high-pitched falsetto, causing his companions to laugh even harder. The mockery stung worse than any physical blow might have. At that very moment, as hope seemed to drain from Asiata's heart, a black SUV appeared in the distance. The vehicle moved slowly along the road, its windows tinted dark against the harsh sunlight. It was clearly not a local vehicle. Too clean, too expensive, too official-looking for these rural surroundings. The driver noticed the commotion at the roadside checkpoint and began to slow down. As the vehicle came to a complete stop about 30 meters away, the rear door opened with a soft click. A tall figure emerged from the air-conditioned interior into the sweltering heat. The man who stepped out wore simple, civilian clothes, a plain shirt and trousers that could have belonged to any middle-class citizen of Burkina Faso. But there was something about his bearing that commanded attention. His face carried an air of authority, and his eyes held a penetrating quality that seemed to take in everything at once. His posture was straight and confident, and he moved with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to being obeyed. This was no ordinary traveler. This was President Ibrahim Traoré himself, returning from an inspection tour of nearby districts. He had insisted on traveling with minimal security, wanting to see his country as it truly was, not through the filtered lens of official state visits with their elaborate preparations and carefully staged scenes. The driver, a loyal aide who had served the president for several years, glanced nervously at the scene ahead. "Sir," he said quietly, "it appears some soldiers are harassing civilians." There was concern in his voice, concern for the civilians, but also concern about what his unpredictable president might do next. President Ibrahim raised his hand in a gesture that commanded silence. He said nothing, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Without waiting for his security detail to clear the way or assess the situation, he began walking toward the group of soldiers and women. His shoes, polished that morning in the capital, quickly accumulated a coating of red dust as he strode along the road. His presence created an immediate stir among the bystanders. People who had been watching from a safe distance began to move closer, drawn by curiosity and something else. Perhaps a hope they dared not name. An old man, his face weathered by decades of harsh sun and hard work, recognized the president first. "That's him," he whispered urgently to his neighbor, his voice a mix of disbelief and excitement. "That's President Traoré. I've seen him on television." The whisper spread through the small crowd like wildfire. The president is here. President Traoré himself." The murmurs grew louder, creating a buzz of anticipation. What was the head of state doing here, in this forgotten corner of the country? And more importantly, what would he do? President Ibrahim approached the soldiers with measured steps, his face a mask of calm inquiry. When he was close enough to be heard clearly, he spoke in a voice that was neither loud nor soft, but carried the weight of authority nonetheless. "What exactly is happening here?" One of the soldiers, not bothering to look closely at the newcomer, responded with casual disrespect. "Just routine security checks, sir. Nothing to concern yourself with." His tone suggested that this civilian should mind his own business and move along. The president's expression darkened. A single word escaped his lips, laden with unmistakable disapproval. "Checks?" He paused, letting the word hang in the air like an accusation. "Or harassment?" The soldier finally looked up, really looked at the man addressing him. There was something familiar about that face, something that triggered a flutter of recognition in his mind. He squinted, trying to place where he had seen this man before. His companions also began to pay attention, sensing that something was amiss. President Ibrahim reached into his pocket with deliberate slowness and withdrew his official identification card. He held it up so that the afternoon sun illuminated it clearly, the national seal glinting in the light. His voice, when he spoke again, was as hard as iron. I am Captain Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, and I am your Commander-in-Chief. The effect of those words was instantaneous and profound. It was as if time itself had frozen. The soldiers' faces drained of color, their expressions shifting from arrogance to shock to dawning horror in the space of a few heartbeats. Their rifles, which moments ago had been instruments of intimidation, now seemed like millstones around their necks. The young women stopped their nervous fidgeting and stood still, hardly daring to breathe. Aziada felt her heart leap in her chest, not from fear this time, but from a wild surge of hope and vindication. The villagers who had been watching from a distance pressed closer, unable to believe what they were witnessing. Their president, the man they had only seen on television screens and in newspaper photographs, was standing right here, on their dusty village road, confronting soldiers who had been terrorizing their daughters and sisters. This moment, this single point in time, would become a turning point in the history of Burkina Faso. It would be talked about for years to come, passed down from parent to child, recounted in marketplaces and around cooking fires. The day the president stood for justice. President Ibrahim walked slowly toward the soldiers, closing the distance between them until he stood directly before them. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and measured, but each word fell like a hammer blow. That uniform you wear does not give you power. It gives you responsibility. It makes you servants of the people, not their masters. Now tell me, what did you do to these young women? The soldier who had spoken so arrogantly moments before now stammered like a schoolboy caught in a lie. Sir, we were just conducting routine checks, sir. Standard security procedures. We meant no harm. His voice cracked on the last word. Routine checks? The president's voice rose slightly, carrying a sharp edge of anger. Under the guise of security checks, you were humiliating them. You were abusing the authority given to you by the people of this nation. You should be ashamed of yourselves. The soldier fell silent, unable to meet the president's gaze. Sweat poured down his face, mixing with the dust that coated his skin. His hands trembled where they hung at his sides, and his companions stood equally frozen. Their earlier bravado completely evaporated. President Ibrahim turned his attention to Aziada, his expression softening immediately. His voice, so hard moments before, now carried genuine warmth and concern. My daughter, don't be afraid. What happened to you will not go unpunished. No one will harm you anymore. As the president spoke these words of comfort, another soldier tried one last desperate gambit to shift the blame. His voice was pleading, almost whining. Sir, these girls are making false accusations against us. We were just doing our jobs. They're trying to get us in trouble for no reason. The audacity of this claim caused President Ibrahim's face to harden once more. His eyes flashed with anger, and when he spoke, his voice carried the full weight of his authority. How dare you try to turn truth into lies? When a woman raises her voice to protect her dignity, she is not making false accusations. She is standing up for her rights, rights that you, as a soldier of Burkina Faso, are sworn to protect, not violate. He took a step closer to the soldier who had spoken, forcing the man to look into his eyes. Let me make something very clear to all of you. A woman's testimony about harassment and abuse is not an accusation to be dismissed. It is a cry for justice that demands to be heard. And today, it will be heard. The villagers, who had been silent observers up until this moment, began to find their voices. What started as a single shout of "Long live the president!" quickly grew into a chorus. We want justice, someone called out. Protect our daughters, another voice added. The crowd was growing bolder, empowered by their president's presence and his clear stand for what was right. Sensing the mood turning against them and perhaps fearing mob justice, one of the soldiers reached for his rifle. It was an instinctive action born of panic rather than any coherent plan, but it was enough to cause gasps of alarm from the crowd. President Ibrahim's response was immediate and uncompromising. His voice cut through the rising tension like a blade. If anyone makes a threatening move, if anyone raises a weapon, it will be considered an act of aggression against civilians under my protection. I hereby order the immediate arrest of these 3 soldiers. The president's security detail, who had been standing at a respectful distance, moved forward swiftly. They were professional soldiers, trained and disciplined, and they knew how to execute an order without hesitation. Within moments, all 3 soldiers were disarmed and had their hands secured behind their backs with metal handcuffs. The expressions on the arrested soldiers' faces were studies in contrasts. Shame, fear, disbelief, and resignation all warring for dominance. They had started this day as men with power and authority, able to bully and intimidate at will. Now they stood stripped of that power, reduced to prisoners awaiting judgment. The watching crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Women who had been too frightened to raise their voices in protest now shouted their approval. Men who had felt helpless to protect their daughters and sisters now raised their fists in celebration. Children, not fully understanding but caught up in the emotion of the moment, jumped and clapped. Asiata, tears streaming down her face, managed to choke out words through her sobs. "Sir, we thought no one would listen to us. We thought no one cared." Her voice broke with emotion, not just relief, but a profound sense of validation. Her courage in speaking up had been vindicated. President Ibrahim placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, a gesture both paternal and respectful. When those in authority become blind to injustice, the whole nation suffers paralysis. When leaders turn away from the cries of their people, society itself begins to die. But not today. Today, in Burkina Faso, justice has come down from its lofty halls and stands here in the street, among the people it is meant to serve. The crowd's applause grew even louder. Some women wept openly, tears not of weakness but of strength, tears of release after years of fear and frustration. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, the significance of what had just happened. Their president was not merely a distant figure in a palace. He was here, among them, fighting for them. An elderly woman pushed her way through the crowd, her aged body moving with surprising vigor. She reached President Ibrahim and seized his hand, bringing it to her forehead in a gesture of deep respect and gratitude. "My son," she said, her voice quavering with emotion, "may God keep you safe. We had lost all hope of living with dignity. Today you have given us back our humanity." The president bent down, showing deep respect to the elderly woman. He kissed her weathered hand in return, a gesture that brought fresh tears to many eyes. "Mother," he said softly but clearly enough for all to hear, "this nation belongs to you, to all of you. As long as I have the prayers of mothers like you, no one will be allowed to harm your daughters. This is my promise to you." The scene was so moving that even some of the president's security detail, hardened men who had seen combat and violence, found themselves blinking back tears. This was not the behavior they were accustomed to from political leaders. This was something different, something rare and precious. Asiata, who had been trembling with fear just minutes ago, now stood tall and straight. There was a new confidence in her bearing, a light in her eyes that had not been there before. She stepped forward, moving closer to the president with none of her earlier hesitation. "Sir," she said, her voice now steady and clear, "I wanted to continue my education, but fear forced me to leave school. When the very people who wear uniforms to protect us become sources of terror, where can we turn? Where is it safe for us to go?" President Ibrahim regarded her thoughtfully, seeing in this young woman's courage a reflection of the best qualities of his nation. "Your words today have taught me an important lesson," he said. "Real change does not come from textbooks or legislation alone. It comes from bravery. The bravery to speak truth to power, the courage to stand up when it would be easier to stay silent. Young women like you, daughters of Burkina Faso, you are our true strength. You are the future we are fighting to protect." He turned back to the arrested soldiers, his expression hardening once more. "You took the uniform that should represent honor and you dishonored it. You betrayed the trust placed in you. A simple apology cannot erase what you have done. You will face military justice, and you will answer for your crimes in a court of law." President Ibrahim gave orders for the 3 soldiers to be transported immediately to Ouagadougou, the capital city, where they would face a military tribunal. This was not just about punishing 3 individuals. It was about sending a message that would resonate throughout the entire military, and indeed throughout the entire nation. News of what had happened spread like wildfire across the region. People pulled out their mobile phones, recording videos and taking photographs. Young people immediately began live streaming the event on social media platforms. Within hours, the story was trending across Burkina Faso and beyond. The headlines wrote themselves. President Ibrahim Traoré personally arrests soldiers for harassment. Justice comes to rural Burkina Faso. A president who walks among his people. International news agencies picked up the story, and soon the world was watching this small African nation with newfound interest and respect. In the village, the atmosphere had completely transformed. Where there had been fear and oppression, there was now a sense of liberation and hope. Women talked excitedly among themselves, their voices animated and joyful. "For the first time, I feel truly free," one of them said, her face glowing with happiness. A young boy tugged on his father's sleeve, his eyes wide with admiration. "Father," he said earnestly, "when I grow up, I want to join the military. But not like those bad soldiers. I want to be like the president, someone who protects people and stands up for what is right." His father placed a hand on the boy's head, his own eyes misty with emotion. "Study hard, my son. Learn well. Our country needs good men like that." President Ibrahim, preparing to depart, turned to address the assembled crowd one final time. His voice carried clearly in the still air of evening, which was beginning to cool after the scorching heat of the day. "I make you this solemn promise," he declared, his right hand raised as if taking an oath. "We will restore honor to the uniform of our military. This land will no longer belong to oppressors. It will belong to those who seek justice, who protect the weak, who serve with integrity. This is my commitment to you as your president, but more importantly, as your fellow citizen." The crowd roared their approval. "Long live President Traoré! Long live Burkina Faso! Long live justice!" The chants continued even as the president's vehicle drove away, carrying him back toward the capital. But this was not an ending. It was a beginning. The beginning of a new chapter in Burkina Faso's history. The next morning, at the military headquarters in Ouagadougou, there was an unusual level of activity. Guards at the main gate stood at attention with particular vigilance. Inside the main conference hall, the 3 arrested soldiers stood with heads bowed, their handcuffs removed, but their shame evident in every line of their bodies. Before them sat a panel of senior military officers appointed by President Traoré to investigate the case. On the table lay a thick file marked with large letters: "Civilian abuse, misuse of authority, moral crimes." The lead investigating officer, a stern man with decades of military service behind him, opened the proceedings with harsh words. "You were given the privilege of wearing the uniform of Burkina Faso. That uniform represents honor, duty, and service. It is not a license for intimidation and harassment. How dare you abuse it in this manner?" One of the accused soldiers tried to mount a defense, his voice desperate. "Sir, we made a mistake. Those girls were being disrespectful to us. We were just trying to maintain order." The officer slammed his hand on the table, the sharp sound echoing through the hall. "Silence! The truth has already been established. We have video recordings, eyewitness testimonies, and most damning of all, we have the testimony of President Traoré himself. Everything speaks against you." A heavy silence fell over the room. On the wall behind the panel hung the flag of Burkina Faso, its colors bright against the white wall. Next to it was an official portrait of President Traoré, his steady gaze seeming to watch over the proceedings, ensuring that justice would be done. The investigating officer picked up his pen and began to write. "These soldiers are found guilty under Article 11 of the Military Code of Justice, civilian humiliation, illegal use of authority, and harassment of women. They are hereby dishonorably discharged from military service and will face additional criminal penalties as determined by the military court." The verdict was delivered swiftly and decisively. All 3 soldiers were stripped of their ranks, their military careers ended in disgrace. They would face further punishment, imprisonment, fines, and the permanent stain on their records that would follow them for the rest of their lives. That evening, the case file was delivered to the presidential palace. President Ibrahim Traoré opened it in his private office, reading through the findings in silence. When he finished, he sat back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "The wheels of justice have begun to turn," he said to his aide, who stood nearby. "But justice is not complete until the people themselves feel safe, until they trust that the system will protect them rather than oppress them." He gave orders for a press conference to be arranged for the following morning. It was important that the nation understand what had happened and, more importantly, what would happen going forward. This could not be treated as an isolated incident. It had to become a catalyst for broader reform. The next day, television cameras were set up in the main press room of the presidential palace. Journalists from across the country and several international news agencies filled the seats, their cameras ready, their questions prepared. There was a palpable sense of anticipation in the air. Everyone knew that what the president said today would have far-reaching implications. President Ibrahim Traoré entered the room punctually, walking to the podium with his characteristic, confident stride. He arranged his notes, looked directly into the cameras, and began to speak. "My fellow citizens of Burkina Faso," he began, his voice carrying the weight of sincerity and determination. "Our military exists to serve the people, not to oppress them. The uniform of our armed forces should inspire confidence and safety, not fear and dread." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "The men who abused their authority, who harassed innocent women, who betrayed the trust placed in them, they have been held accountable. They have been judged and found guilty. But more than their punishment, I want to address the young women who suffered at their hands." The cameras zoomed in slightly as his expression softened. "I personally apologize to Asiata and her companions. I apologize on behalf of the government of Burkina Faso, on behalf of our military, and on behalf of every decent citizen of this nation. The honor of our state cannot be preserved if we allow the honor of our women to be trampled upon." The press room erupted in applause. Journalists, who were supposed to remain neutral observers, found themselves moved by the president's words. This was not political theater. This was genuine remorse and a commitment to change. President Traoré continued, his voice growing stronger. "But apologies are not enough. Actions must follow words. Therefore, I am announcing today a comprehensive reform of our military training programs. Every soldier, from the lowest private to the highest general, will undergo mandatory training in human rights, ethical conduct, and civilian relations." He outlined additional measures: the establishment of civilian oversight committees for the military, hotlines for reporting abuse, protection for whistleblowers, and harsh penalties for anyone who violated the new codes of conduct. These were not mere promises. They were concrete policies that would be implemented immediately. The press conference lasted over an hour, with the president taking questions from journalists and providing detailed answers. When it finally concluded, the consensus was clear. Burkina Faso was embarking on a new path, one that prioritized justice and human dignity. Several days later, as the sun rose over Ouagadougou, there was news that sent ripples of excitement through the nation. President Traoré was returning to the village where the incident had occurred. This was unprecedented. Presidents typically made official state visits with advanced preparations, security sweeps, and carefully choreographed events. But Traoré was different. He wanted to return as he had come before, simply, directly, and with genuine purpose. The villagers began gathering along the main road hours before the president's scheduled arrival. Women wore their best clothing, colorful traditional dresses that brightened the dusty landscape. Children clutched small flags, their faces shining with excitement. Elderly men sat on wooden chairs brought out from their homes, waiting patiently to witness this historic moment. The atmosphere was completely different from that fateful day when soldiers had terrorized women on this road. Now there was anticipation, pride, and hope instead of fear. Around midday, the presidential convoy appeared in the distance. It was small by official standards, just a few vehicles, minimal security. As the black SUV came to a stop, President Ibrahim Traoré stepped out, and the crowd erupted in applause and cheers. But what happened next surprised everyone. Instead of maintaining a formal distance, Instead of being surrounded by a cordon of security guards, the president walked directly into the crowd. He shook hands, exchanged greetings, and moved among the people as if he were one of them, which, in his view, he was. "I have not come here as your president," he announced, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "I have come as a fellow citizen, as someone who shares your hopes and your struggles, as someone committed to building a nation where justice prevails." He walked to the exact spot where the incident had occurred. The dust was still there, the same red earth that had witnessed injustice. President Ibrahim looked down at the ground, then slowly around at the faces watching him. "This place," he said quietly but with intensity, "reminds us that the abuse of power is the greatest betrayal of humanity. It reminds us that those who are given authority must use it to serve, not to dominate." He turned to face the crowd more fully, and his voice grew stronger. "I, Ibrahim Traoré, as president of this nation, apologize to the daughters of Burkina Faso. If those wearing our uniform caused you pain, if they made you feel unsafe in your own land, then that failure is mine as well. And I promise you, it will not happen again." An elderly woman, tears streaming down her weathered face, pushed forward through the crowd. With trembling hands, she reached up and placed her palm on the president's head in a traditional blessing. "My son," she said, her voice breaking with emotion, "you have won our hearts today. We never imagined that a leader would come himself to apologize, to acknowledge our pain." Then Aziata stepped forward. The young woman who had been so frightened weeks ago now stood tall, her bearing confident and proud. She looked the president in the eye as she spoke. "Sir, I was afraid to continue my education because of what happened. I thought that if those in uniform could not be trusted, then where was safety to be found? But you have shown us that justice exists, that courage matters, that speaking truth can bring change." President Ibrahim smiled warmly at her. "Aziata, your bravery has inspired this entire nation. You have shown us that real strength comes not from weapons or authority, but from the courage to stand up for what is right. You are a hero to Burkina Faso." Then he made an announcement that shocked everyone present. "Aziata will be enrolled in the National Guard Reserve Force. She will receive training, education, and support. She represents a new generation of protectors, those who understand that true security comes from respecting and protecting every citizen." The crowd's cheers were deafening. Children jumped up and down with excitement. Adults embraced each other, many with tears running down their faces. This was more than they had hoped for, more than they had dreamed possible. President Traoré raised his hands for silence, and gradually the crowd quieted to hear his final words. "This nation will be strong when our daughters are safe, when our women are respected, when every citizen, regardless of gender, wealth, or status, can live without fear. This is not just my promise. This is our promise as a nation." As the sun began to set that evening, casting long shadows across the village, there was a palpable sense that something fundamental had changed. The light of justice had been lit in this small corner of Burkina Faso, and its glow would spread across the entire nation. The reforms announced by President Traoré were implemented with remarkable speed and efficiency. Within weeks, new training programs were established at every military base across Burkina Faso. Soldiers attended mandatory classes on human rights, ethical conduct, and the proper treatment of civilians. Officers were required to sign codes of conduct acknowledging their responsibilities to the people they served. But the changes went deeper than just training programs. A cultural shift was beginning within the military itself. The old attitude of superiority and entitlement was being challenged and replaced with a new ethos of service and protection. Senior officers who had operated under the old system found themselves either adapting to the new standards or being retired early. Aziata's story became a case study in schools, universities, and mosques across the nation. Her courage was held up as an example of what every citizen should aspire to: the bravery to speak truth to power, the strength to stand up for dignity and justice. Social media buzzed with discussions about the changes sweeping through Burkina Faso. Hashtags like "Justice in Burkina Faso" and "Dashers Asia the Brave" trended internationally. News articles appeared in major publications around the world, praising this small African nation for taking bold steps toward reform. International organizations took notice. The United Nations, the African Union, and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation all issued statements commending President Traoré's actions. Several other African nations reached out, asking for guidance on implementing similar reforms in their own militaries. Assata herself was invited to speak at various events. At first, she was nervous about public speaking, but she quickly discovered that her authenticity and sincerity resonated with audiences. At a university in Ouagadougou, she addressed a packed auditorium. "I am not special," she told the students. "I am just a girl who refused to accept that fear should govern my life. Every person in this room has that same courage within them. The question is whether you will find it when the moment comes." Her words inspired a new generation of young women across Burkina Faso. Applications to join the military and police forces surged, particularly from female applicants. The National Guard Reserve Force, which had been a small and often overlooked branch of the military, suddenly became one of the most sought-after positions in the country. The transformation was not without challenges. Some old guard military officers resisted the changes, seeing them as an affront to traditional military culture. There were incidents of pushback, moments when it seemed the reforms might stall or be watered down. But President Traoré remained steadfast. He personally visited military bases, speaking directly to soldiers about the importance of the changes. He made it clear that resistance would not be tolerated, that the new standards were non-negotiable. "Some of you may think these reforms are too harsh," he told a gathering of senior officers. "You may believe that we are making the military soft, that we are undermining discipline and order. But I tell you this, true strength comes from restraint, from knowing when to use force and when to show mercy. A soldier who cannot control themselves around civilians is not strong. They are weak. They are a danger to themselves and to others." His words, direct and uncompromising, left no room for doubt about his commitment to reform. As months passed, the effects of the reforms became increasingly visible. Reports of military harassment dropped dramatically. Civilian complaints against soldiers decreased by over 80% in the first year alone. More importantly, there was a noticeable improvement in the relationship between the military and civilian populations. In villages and towns across Burkina Faso, soldiers were now welcomed rather than feared. They participated in community projects, helped with infrastructure development, and engaged in dialogue with local leaders. The image of the military was being transformed from oppressors to protectors, from a force to be feared to an institution that served the people. International recognition continued to pour in. President Traoré was invited to speak at the United Nations General Assembly, where he shared Burkina Faso's experience with military reform. His speech was met with a standing ovation, and several other nations committed to implementing similar programs. "What we have learned in Burkina Faso," he told the assembled world leaders, "is that true security comes not from the barrel of a gun, but from the trust between a government and its people. When citizens believe that those in power will protect them rather than prey upon them, when they see justice applied fairly and consistently, then real stability becomes possible." Back home, celebrations continued. A national holiday was declared, Justice Day, to commemorate the reforms and to honor all those who had suffered under the old system and those who had fought for change. The day was marked by ceremonies across the nation. In the capital, a monument was unveiled. A bronze statue of a young woman standing tall, her head held high, representing courage and dignity. The plaque at its base read, "In honor of all who speak truth to power." Assata was invited to the unveiling ceremony. Standing before the statue, seeing her own courage immortalized in bronze, she felt overwhelmed with emotion. "This is not just my story," she said to the gathered crowd. "This is our story, the story of every woman who refused to be silent, every person who demanded justice, every citizen who believed that change was possible." Assata's journey through the National Guard Reserve Force training was documented by media teams, becoming a symbol of the new Burkina Faso. The training center in Ouagadougou once an intimidating fortress-like structure, now bustled with energy and purpose as women from all corners of the country arrived to begin their service. On her first day, Asiata stood among dozens of other female recruits in the main courtyard. The morning sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The training grounds stretched before them, obstacle courses, shooting ranges, classroom buildings, and barracks that would be their home for the next 6 months. The head instructor, a woman named Colonel Aminata Kabori, walked along the line of recruits with measured steps. She was a veteran soldier, one of the few women who had risen through the ranks in the old system through sheer determination and excellence. Now, she had been given the honor of training this new generation. "Listen carefully," Colonel Kabore said, her voice firm but not harsh. "The uniform you will wear does not make you superior to anyone. It makes you a servant of the people, a protector of the weak, a guardian of justice. If you forget this, you have no place here." The training was rigorous, designed to build not just physical strength but mental resilience and moral character. Each day began at 4 a.m. with a 5-kilometer run through the streets of Ouagadougou. At first, Asiata struggled to keep pace with the more physically fit recruits, her legs burning and her lungs gasping for air. But she pushed through, remembering the words President Traoré had spoken to her. "You are our true strength." After the morning run came combat training, weapons handling, first aid instruction, and tactical exercises. But what made this training program unique were the afternoon sessions dedicated to ethics, human rights, and community relations. In one such session, a human rights lawyer named Dr. Umaru led a discussion about the proper treatment of civilians during security operations. "You will be given authority and weapons," he explained to the attentive recruits. "This creates an imbalance of power between you and ordinary citizens. Your job is not to exploit that imbalance, but to use it responsibly to protect those who cannot protect themselves." Asiata raised her hand. "Sir, what should a soldier do if they see their colleague abusing their authority?" Dr. Umaru smiled approvingly. "That is exactly the right question. Under the new code of conduct, every soldier has a duty to report misconduct. Silence in the face of injustice makes you complicit. Your loyalty is not to individual soldiers, it is to the principles of justice and to the people of Burkina Faso." These lessons resonated deeply with Asiata. She took detailed notes, asked probing questions, and often stayed after class to discuss complex scenarios with the instructors. Her dedication did not go unnoticed. One evening, as the sun set over the training grounds, Colonel Kabore called Asiata to her office. The young recruit entered nervously, unsure if she had done something wrong. "Sit down, Asiata," the colonel said, her tone gentler than usual. "I've been watching you. Your physical scores are improving steadily, but what impresses me most is your understanding of why we're here. You grasp something that many career soldiers never learn, that real strength is measured not by how much force you can exert, but by how much restraint you can show." Asiata felt tears prick her eyes. "Ma'am, I just don't want anyone else to go through what I experienced. If I can prevent even one person from feeling that helplessness, then all of this will be worth it." Colonel Kabore nodded slowly. "That's the spirit we need. That's what will transform our military and our nation." As Asiata's training progressed, media interest intensified. A documentary crew was given permission to film portions of the training program, and their footage was broadcast nationally every week. The program, titled Guardians of the New Dawn, became the most watched show in Burkina Faso's television history. Viewers saw not just combat training and military discipline, but also the human side of these recruits. They saw women discussing their fears and hopes, supporting each other through difficult challenges, and learning to embody the values of the new military ethos. One particularly powerful segment showed Asiata during a role-playing exercise. She was assigned to play a soldier conducting a civilian checkpoint while other recruits played villagers passing through. The exercise was designed to teach proper procedures and respectful interaction. As Asiata checked documents and searched bags, she maintained eye contact, spoke politely, and explained her actions. When one recruit playing a nervous civilian became flustered, Asiata immediately stepped back, gave them space, and spoke in a calming voice. "I'm here to keep you safe, not to frighten you," she said in the exercise. "Please, take your time." The instructor observing the exercise nodded approvingly. "That," he told the other recruits, "is how it should be done. Authority exercised with compassion." The footage of this exercise went viral on social media. People shared it with comments like, "This is the Burkina Faso we deserve," and, finally, "Soldiers who understand their purpose." Letters and emails poured into the training center addressed to Asiata. Some were from young girls expressing their admiration and desire to follow in her footsteps. Others were from parents thanking her for inspiring their daughters. A few were from former soldiers expressing shame for their past behavior and pledging to be better. One letter from an elderly woman in a remote village particularly moved Asiata. It read, "Dear daughter Asiata, I am 73 years old. I have lived my entire life afraid of those in uniform. Because of you, my granddaughter now dreams of wearing that uniform herself, not to hold power over others, but to protect them. You have changed not just your own life, but the future of our entire nation. May God bless you." Asiata kept this letter tucked into her training manual, reading it whenever she felt exhausted or discouraged. It reminded her that her struggle had meaning beyond her personal experience. 6 months passed swiftly, and the day of graduation arrived. The training center was transformed for the ceremony. A large platform had been erected in the main courtyard, decorated with the national flag and banners proclaiming "Service, Honor, Protection." Hundreds of chairs were arranged in neat rows for family members, government officials, and media representatives. President Ibrahim Traoré arrived early, walking through the grounds and personally greeting the graduating recruits as they prepared for the ceremony. When he reached Asiata, he paused and smiled. "How do you feel?" he asked her. "Proud, sir, and determined. I'm ready to serve my country the right way." "You already have," he replied. "Your courage started all of this. Never forget that." The ceremony began with the national anthem, sung by all present with unusual fervor and emotion. Then Colonel Kabore took the podium to address the graduates. "Today, you complete your training and begin your service as members of Burkina Faso's National Guard Reserve Force. You are not just soldiers. You are ambassadors of a new way, representatives of what our military can and should be. The eyes of the nation are upon you. Do not disappoint them." One by one, the recruits marched forward to receive their certificates and insignia. When Asiata's name was called, the applause was thunderous. She walked to the platform with her head held high, received her certificate from President Traoré himself, and saluted with precision. But the president did something unexpected. Instead of simply returning her salute, he stepped forward and embraced her in a fatherly hug. "Thank you," he whispered, "for reminding us all what courage looks like." After all the certificates had been distributed, President Traoré delivered the keynote address. His voice carried across the assembled crowd with power and conviction. "Today we celebrate more than the graduation of fine soldiers. We celebrate the transformation of a nation. We celebrate the victory of justice over oppression, of courage over fear, of humanity over brutality. These young women and men standing before us represent our highest ideals. They have been trained not just in combat, but in compassion. Not just in tactics, but in ethics. They understand that the purpose of military power is not to dominate, but to protect." He paused, looking directly at the graduates. "You will face challenges. There will be times when the easy path is to abuse your authority, to take shortcuts, to forget the principles you learned here. In those moments, remember Asiata. Remember the courage it took for one young woman to speak truth to power. Remember that real strength is measured by how you treat those who are powerless." The ceremony concluded with a passing-out parade, where the graduates marched in perfect formation, their bearing proud and their steps synchronized. As they passed the reviewing stand, their families cheered, children waved flags, and tears flowed freely. For Asiata, marching in that parade felt like the culmination of a journey that had begun on a dusty village road with an act of harassment that could have destroyed her spirit. Instead, it had forged her into a symbol of hope and transformation. The girl who once trembled with fear was now a guardian of justice, ready to ensure that no one else would have to endure what she had experienced. As the parade concluded and the graduates dispersed to celebrate with their families, President Traoré stood watching with deep satisfaction. His aide approached and asked, "Are you pleased with the results, sir?" "More than pleased," the president replied. "This is what nation-building looks like. Not grand infrastructure projects or international treaties, but the transformation of hearts and minds. If we can change how our military sees its role, we can change everything." 2 years after that fateful day on a dusty village road, Burkina Faso had become a model for military reform across Africa. The changes initiated by President Traoré had taken deep root, transforming not just the military, but the entire relationship between government institutions and civilians. Assata, now a respected member of the National Guard, had been promoted to sergeant and led her own unit specializing in community protection and civilian liaison. She traveled throughout Burkina Faso, training new recruits and speaking at schools and community centers about courage, justice, and the proper use of authority. The 3 soldiers who had harassed her and her companions had completed their prison sentences and were released, their military careers permanently over. Interestingly, one of them sought out Assata after his release, wanting to apologize in person. The meeting took place at a small cafe in Ouagadougou, arranged by a restorative justice program that President Traoré had established. The former soldier, whose name was Boubacar, sat across from Assata with his eyes downcast. "I have no right to ask for your forgiveness," he began, his voice trembling. "What I did was unforgivable. But I want you to know that my time in prison, the therapy I received, the education programs, they opened my eyes. I was raised to believe that power was something to be used for personal advantage. I never understood that it was supposed to be a responsibility." Assata listened quietly, then responded with grace that surprised even herself. "What you did caused me pain and fear, but it also led to something important, a change that has affected our entire nation. I don't know if I can fully forgive yet, but I can acknowledge that you've tried to become a better person. That matters." The story of this meeting was shared widely, becoming another chapter in the ongoing narrative of Burkina Faso's transformation. It showed that justice was not just about punishment, but also about rehabilitation and redemption. As the sun set over Burkina Faso on that evening, casting golden light across the capital city, President Ibrahim Traoré stood on the balcony of the presidential palace, looking out over his nation. He thought about how far they had come, from a country where military harassment was accepted as normal to one where justice and dignity were protected rights. There was still work to be done. Poverty remained a challenge. Infrastructure needed development, and not all problems could be solved by military reform alone. But a foundation had been laid, a precedent set. The people of Burkina Faso now knew that their voices mattered, that courage could bring change, and that leaders could be held accountable. In villages and cities across the nation, as families gathered for evening meals, as children prepared for bed, as elders shared stories by firelight, there was a common thread, a sense of pride and hope that had not existed before. They were building something new, something better, something worthy of the sacrifices and courage of people like Assata. And on that dusty village road where it all began, a small monument had been erected. It bore a simple inscription, "Here, justice prevailed. May it always prevail in Burkina Faso, the end."